more you listen, the more you know. This is Good Politics with Dr. Wilson and Adam Whiteman.
Welcome to this week's episode of Good Politics. Last week we dove into a lot of Trump's impeachment, and this week we have a bit more, don't we, Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, we're going to do a big show today. I wanted to mention a couple of things. We've got our YouTube page now listed as our homepage. So if you go to any of our websites on Facebook or find our podcast, you'll be able to find the YouTube page really easily. And to find any of the sites, you just, Google Good Politics, Dr. Wilson, or Good Politics and Podcast. I'm sure you'll find it somewhere.
It's brilliant. All right.
So to get started today, what I'd like to do is we're going to go retro before we come back to the current impeachment. We're going to go look at Nixon. Alan Dershowitz thinks that Richard Nixon was the only president who lawfully should have been impeached because he was the only president who actually really did something seriously wrong, really broke high crimes and misdemeanors. And to get into that, let's play clip number 51.
On June 17, 1972, 5 men who had been hired by the committee to re-elect the president were arrested, trying to bug the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex. It was one part of a large clandestine effort to ensure Nixon's re-election. That fall, he won by a landslide, beating Senator George McGovern by nearly 18 million votes. But investigations into the Watergate break-in continued, eventually tying the White House to the burglary.
Okay, I need a quick history lesson here. So real quick, McGovern, if I remember correctly, was the Bernie Sanders of the time.
Right.
And he was running against Nixon.
Right.
Nixon, from what I remember, had a lot of experience. He was a senator and a bunch of other things. But then he had people literally break in. Yeah.
So there's a lot of things to talk with about Nixon, but let's just go slow. So one of the things you should notice is that everyone understands that the Nixon people broke into the Watergate Hotel, to the Democratic National Headquarters, but they don't really understand why he broke in. And the answer is he broke in because he was looking for opposition research, and he wanted to bug the place. Opposition research is what a candidate uses from one candidate against another. So what Nixon was after was information. And that's actually not the first time that they broke into the Democratic National Headquarters.
They broke in twice?
Yeah, they broke in more than once. They went in the first time and they made mistakes. And so they had to go in a second time. And it's also not the only break-in that Nixon was involved in. Let's play clip number 52.
In a White House memo regarding the neutralization of Daniel Ellsberg, the plumbers discussed how they might destroy his public image and credibility. In search of damaging information about Ellsberg's private life, they arranged a break-in at the office of his psychiatrist.
They apparently broke a window on the way in, and realizing that it could no longer be viewed as a covert operation, changed courses and decided to make it look as if it had been entered by a burglar looking for drugs or some other substances. Basically, they smashed up the office.
Wow, that's very illegal. These are confidential documents, very personal documents. This is a psychiatrist's office?
Yeah.
Is that what it was?
What I would take from that is a couple of things. Nixon broke into a psychiatrist's office of Daniel Ellsberg, but Daniel Ellsberg, you'll notice, wasn't running against him. This wasn't opposition research. It was simply trying to get dirt to smear Ellsberg because Ellsberg had done something bad. He had taken classified information about the Vietnam War and basically had leaked it and gave it to the New York Times. And Nixon had been elected, and he was obviously involved in the Vietnam War, supposedly getting us out of it, but he wasn't. For a long time, he was prolonging it to try to get a better peace, he said. And so because Ellsberg had done this, they were trying to do anything they could to smear him. When I say Nixon, we have to be careful. It was Nixon's people. And the question is how much Nixon knew, but I think it's pretty clear he knew quite a bit. He knew quite a bit.
Right.
So
Ellsberg was a whistleblower. He was
right.
exposing the truth,
exactly.
saying the government was lying about Vietnam.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so here is the second example where Nixon's people are directly breaking in and committing a burglary, a felony, to try to get information on somebody. And not in the first instance, it was information on his Democratic opponent. And in the second instance, it was just information on one of his political enemies. And let's talk a little bit about political enemies, because that's something else that Nixon was doing. Nixon was trying to control political enemies, and he would do it in lots of different ways. Again, he would do it directly. In other words, he would directly break the law, directly do things against his enemies. Let's start with John Lennon. Play clip number 58.
Michael Wilds is the son of John and Yoko's lawyer, Leon Wilds.
Richard Nixon wanted to remove John Lennon from the United States. They found an old drug charge in the UK, and they tried to deport the famous Beatle based on that drug charge.
1968, there was a misdemeanor charge against Lennon for pot. They try and use that as evidence that he needs to be deported. And it's a really trumped up charge, but it's really all they've got. Lennon wants more than anything he wants a green card, but they won't give it to him. And they're threatening him and threatening him. They begin building a file on Lennon. They begin following Lennon, thousands of pages of documentation where the government is monitoring John Lennon.
Nixon is so paranoid that he has Lennon's phones tapped. Leon Wilds was John and Yoko's lawyer.
Well, it was pretty obvious at the time as I would meet with him that the government was listening to our conversations on our phones.
John used to call our house disguised as a woman. John knew he was being tailed by immigration and that phone calls were being listened. If they would set up a meeting or want to talk about something, he would disguise his voice.
Oh, poor John. Everybody loves John Lennon.
Right.
And okay, so he was ticked off at this
He was
hippie.
scared. Well, he was scared of Lennon because Nixon had to run for re-election, and Lennon was thinking about doing something during the Republican National Convention, or maybe it was the Democrat National Convention. Either way, Lennon was involved in politics, was a part of the anti-war movement.
Right.
And the thing to keep in mind here is what did it say? What had happened? Number one, phone taps. What else? Number two, using the immigration office.
Right.
Directly innovating.
Him. He was completely targeting
Now,
John Lennon. I never knew this happened.
Now, well, there's lots of things. Let's do this one now. There's one other one I want to talk about here. Nixon would also sic the IRS on his enemies. Now, we have one here, and it contains a slur involving Hispanic people. So I just wanted to give a little warning on this. It's a bit of an insensitive thing. This is Nixon. Go ahead and play clip number 50.
I want you to direct the most trusted person you have in the Immigration Service that they are to look over all of the activities of the Los Angeles Times, all underlined, to see whether they are violating the wetback thing. Now let me explain, because as a Californian I know, everybody in California hires them. There's no law against it because they are there, because for menial things and so forth. Otis Chandler, I want him checked with regard to his gardener. I understand he's a wetback. We're going after the Chandlers, everyone individually, collectively, their income tax, they're starting this week. Every one of those sons of bitches. Is that clear? Yes, sir. I understand. Do it. Give me a report. Very well, sir.
Why was this? I mean, there was not a political nationalist movement back then, was there? I mean, why was he targeting the Mexican population?
He wasn't. He was targeting the L.A. Times. He was targeting the enemies in the press. They were writing bad stories about him, and so what he was going to do is go find that reporter and sic the IRS on him. And
this is hardball, kind of dirty politics.
Well, this is what we're going to talk about. According to someone like me and someone like Alan Dershowitz, it's not hardball politics, it's high crimes and misdemeanors. Okay,
this is truly...
Right. We're going to draw a distinction in this show between what is politics and what clearly is a third-rate criminal operation that's going on. All right, let's go ahead and do one more thing here. Let's play clip number 53.
And also, never forget, the press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget it.
The press is the enemy. Watch out, Dr. Wilson.
Yeah.
Nixon is coming for you.
Yeah.
Even the professors are the enemy. Anything that spreads truth and intelligence, perhaps. Well, that's why he hated that Ellsberg guy. he was whistleblowing.
This is an interesting look into Nixon's psychology. Nixon had an interesting psychology. He sees, he gets threatened, and he was insecure as a child. He was frail, and he had these wanted to try to overcome these insecurities. And the way that he thought he could overcome them is by being a success. He was really, really neurotically driven to success. And he also wanted to try to make people think that he was tough. It's very important for Nixon to have this veneer where he was tough.
Wow.
So what would happen is he would be driven, and when he had success, he then got depressed. And in the 1970s, the term for this was active negative personality. And what he would do is he got depressed because the challenge was over. So much about it, about getting him motivated, was the fight. And then once he, even if he had achieved something, then he got down, he got depressed. In the White House, he would he was drinking heavily. And there's a story one time when he was drunk and he ordered he ordered preparations for a nuclear strike. And I think it was either in Cambodia or Vietnam. And as the story goes, the plane is loaded with the bomb, and Henry Kissinger has to come in and say, has to stop it. And Henry Kissinger comes in and says, look, don't do this. Wait until the morning when he sobers up. And so that is actually an interesting story that's credibly told by military people about one of the things that Nixon did. By the way,
wow.
You'll notice in that last clip that we ran about the press is the enemy, just to make sure listeners could hear that. Nixon was saying the press is the enemy and the professors are the enemy.
Write that on the blackboard 100 times.
And he's telling that to Henry Kissinger in the Oval Office. You're probably wondering why we're able to hear these Nixon tapes. Well, tape recordings. Nixon was the first president in 1971 to install a 24/7 taping device in the White House. So that was something interesting. Let's go ahead and play clip number 59.
Listen, I don't want a president who's warm on the outside and warm on the inside too. I want one that's warm on the outside, but I want one who, when the tough decisions are made, is cold and tough and will make the right decision without fear of failure.
Wow. Okay. So he wants somebody without fear of failure. We do know that he did fear failure. But the other points, I mean, he
wants to be tough.
Wants to be tough.
Yeah.
So perhaps it was a kind of the compensation for being frail in his childhood. Huh?
Yeah. So anyway, let's.
That's a very valuable glimpse into the psychology on Nixon. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's summarize here. What you have is more than 3 break-ins that occur under his administration. And we didn't talk about other things. He has slush funds. They're paying off witnesses, trying to take care of the witnesses of the burglars that were caught. And
is that part illegal?
Oh yes. Using the slush funds and paying off witnesses is a perfect example. That's what obstruction actually is: tampering with witnesses and stuff like that. Okay, so it's classic paradigm obstruction. It's classic paradigm felonies, And then he does something else. People are learning about this, and the Watergate is breaking in the news. It happens after he got elected. It's Washington Post, and the stories are coming. And then there's eventually a special counsel that gets someone like Robert Mueller, who gets appointed to investigate this. And Nixon reaches a breaking point. Play clip number 56.
The events that followed became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The president has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Because of the president's action, the attorney general has resigned. Elliot Richardson has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused, in a moment of constitutional drama, to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. And half an hour after the special Watergate prosecutor had been fired, agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the special prosecutor, the offices of the Attorney General, and the offices of the Deputy Attorney General.
6 FBI agents present. impeding our operations right now.
All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the President has set himself against his own Attorney General and the Department of Justice. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
More than 50,000 telegrams poured in on Capitol Hill today. So many, Western Union was swamped. Most of them demanded impeaching Mr. Nixon.
These come from Republicans and businessmen and people, most of whom begin their statement by saying, I've supported the president, I've never believed in impeachment, but he's now gone too far, and we want the Congress to take strong action.
In my 3 district offices in the 1 Republican area, my phone calls were 100 to 1 in favor of pursuing the path of impeachment, which was rather shocking to me.
Well, okay, so Saturday Night Massacre wasn't a massacre at all. This was him firing a bunch of people quitting. Well, was he allowed to fire the special prosecutor?
Right. So this is actually interesting. The question is, how do you investigate a president when they're breaking laws? All right, because and so you have this special prosecutor that gets appointed, and yes, he was allowed to fire the special prosecutor, and so when they impeached Nixon, the firing of the prosecutor actually wasn't the issue. It was all the other stuff that was the issue. What happened when he fired the special prosecutor is it made people think he had something to hide. In other words, it politically increased the support for impeachment inquiry. Now, the one thing to talk about is, as time went on, after Nixon resigned, we began to think, maybe we should have a system where the president can't fire the special prosecutor. So they created a brand new office.
And this is somebody who's prosecuting him.
Right. Congress created the office of a special counsel where the attorney general would make a referral to, I think it was a 3-judge court, and they would appoint that counsel. And that counsel then couldn't be fired. And that was upheld in Morrison versus Olson in the 1980s as being constitutional. So that was the regime we had after Nixon. That was our fix, to have a special counsel that couldn't be fired. However, that statute expired, and we reverted back to the system we have now. Mueller is under the old system, the same system that Nixon had. Mueller was capable of being fired, just as Archibald Cox was fired. And Trump, of course, did not do that, did not fire him. Now, the one thing I want to say is you're probably wondering why that statute expired. It's because when you have a counsel investigating the president who can't be fired, what do you think happens? The other party then starts to use that to tear the president down. You had investigations into Whitewater with President Clinton, which turned into an impeachment proceeding because they were trying to get dirt on him.
What was Whitewater?
Whitewater was a land deal that the conflict of interest, that real estate deal, and so they tried to tie the Clintons into it, and in the course of investigating that, they were able to find dirt somewhere else, and then he was also he had the lying under oath with it. They basically were trying to get their political opponents. And the Reagan people thought that the Democrats were doing the same thing with Iran-Contra. There was a special prosecutor appointed there, too. So, but the point is, both parties thought that having an independent special counsel only created the incentive for the party out of power if they could get control of that office to start tearing down the president. And so they ended up letting the statute expire.
That check and balance kind of goes too far sometimes.
Well, it's hard to be neutral when you're in the center of politics. You want to win. Politics is, there's this incentive to battle and to try to win. So anyway, it's a complicated thing. The one thing we can finish up with on Nixon is the procedure. Play clip number 60.
In February 1973, a Senate committee began to look into the president's connection to the Watergate break-in and the subsequent cover-up. That May, the special panel began hearings, which lasted 9 months. Some members of President Nixon's own administration testified against him, including former White House counsel John Dean, who said there had been a cover-up, one he had discussed with the president.
I began by telling the president that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and if the cancer was not removed, the president himself would be killed by it.
Which part should we focus on? There's a lot there. There was a cancer on the presidency that would overcome him.
Well, I would focus on the process. It was over 9 months. It was public, and it involved both sides having subpoena power. It was bipartisan, and so it was actually it wasn't a political impeachment. And you'll notice that
a real impeachment, meaning for high crimes and misdemeanors, rather than unethical moves.
Right, exactly. For serious matters of serious criminality and so forth. And the interesting thing is that the Democrats, with Trump, they did try that procedure. They had Mueller. There was this investigation into whether the president had some serious criminality, whether he was being controlled by foreign agents, whether the Russians were controlling him. And then that morphed into whether he was obstructing the investigation. And you'll notice the Democrats, one of their first witnesses that they had for the impeachment hearings that Nadler was holding over the summer was John Dean, the guy who testified against Nixon, because they wanted to do that old retro thing. And so one of the problems, though, is that the Mueller report came back and it didn't really show any serious criminality occurring. Volume 1 was it showed there wasn't even probable cause, well, there wasn't enough cause to even make that allegation. And the campaign finance violations had serious problems as well. And then the only thing that came close was this obstruction thing, and that was sort of a wimpy case. So they didn't really have anything in the Mueller report that they could proceed with as far as any kind of severe criminality going on. But they were going to proceed nonetheless. They were trying to, and Pelosi was a little bit unsure. But then what happens is things change. They're going to change their playbook and go with a different way to try to do the impeachment. And when we come back, I think maybe we can look at that.
Find some of those parallels and differences.
Yeah.
Your only source for truly balanced politics. Broadcast from Wright State University, this is Good Politics with Dr. Sean Wilson and Adam Whiteman.